Pass the whiskey. 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 Pass the whiskey.
Pass the whiskey.
Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey. Pass the whiskey.